My boyfriend forced me to go inside a gas station in my pajamas just to teach me a lesson about forgetfulness. He was still sitting on the edge of the bed with his boots half-laced when I set his coffee down on the nightstand, making sure the mug handle pointed toward his right hand the way he prefers it. The house was quiet because his 9-year-old son was still asleep down the hall, and we had about 45 minutes before we needed to load into the truck to start our Saturday errands. I sat down on the rug by the closet, pulling my sweater tight around myself, and told him the Target order from the night before hadn't gone through because I got pulled into a work email right before leaving to meet up with my friend. I saw his shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, just a quick tightening around his jaw before he smoothed it out, took a sip of the black coffee, and said it was fine, we would figure it out later. But I've been with him for a year now, and when you spend 12 months learning the exact cadence of a 40-year-old man's breathing, you know when a phrase like "it's fine" is actually just a placeholder for a conversation he intends to finish when he feels like he has more leverage. We talk about marriage constantly now, looking at houses on Zillow after dinner and comparing how our schedules might align if we decide to combine accounts by the end of the year. When you're 35 and you have ADHD, finding someone who seems grounded feels like hitting a reset button on your entire life. I spent my 20s feeling like a chaotic hurricane of half-finished lists, misplaced keys, and sudden task switches that left everyone around me exhausted. When I got reevaluated last month to start taking my prescriptions again, he sat at the kitchen island, watched me fill out the intake paperwork, and told me he had endless patience for the way my brain worked as long as we kept communication open. He works 60 hours a week doing heavy logistics management, so when he comes home, he expects things to run with a certain predictable precision. I respect how hard he works, so I try to compensate by handling the house, making his lunches, picking him up from his late shifts when his truck is acting up, and trying to keep my natural messiness confined to my own office room. The night before, everything had been running on a tight 15-minute window before I was supposed to meet my friend for dinner downtown. He called me from his office around 6, sounding completely worn down after a 12-hour shift, and asked if I could set up a drive-up order at the Target 3 blocks from our house so he could grab his specific coffee creamer on his way home. I opened the app right away, typed in the brand, added it to the cart, and was about to hit the checkout button when he called back to ask if I could also pick him up a specific type of energy drink for his morning shift. While I was searching the app for the drink, my phone pinged with 3 text messages from my friend asking where I was, followed immediately by an email notification from my boss about a Monday morning client deck. My brain just shattered into 4 directions at once. I grabbed my jacket, threw my keys into my bag, ran out the door, and completely forgot that the Target cart was still sitting on my screen, waiting for my thumb to press confirm. When he texted me 2 hours later asking if the pickup was ready, I felt that familiar knot tighten in my chest, the same knot I've felt since I was 8 years old sitting in front of a report card that said, "has high potential but lacks focus." I apologized immediately, explained that I'd gotten distracted right as I was walking out the door, and offered to drive to the grocery store right then to grab it for him. He texted back telling me not to bother, that he was heading home, and asked if I could just have a sandwich and a cold beer ready for him when he walked through the door because his back was hurting. I dropped everything, drove straight home, made the sandwich exactly how he likes it with the crusts trimmed, pulled his favorite lager from the back of the fridge, and met him at the front door with a smile to take his heavy work bag out of his hands. He ate in front of the TV, thanked me for the food, but maintained a quiet, clinical distance for the rest of the evening, staring at his phone while I washed his work Tupperware in the sink. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I thought the minor slip-up was entirely behind us. He had slept in, and while he was sleeping, I quietly got up, threw on my oversized fleece pajamas, my worn-down house slippers, tied my hair up into a messy knot on top of my head, and drove to the Starbucks drive-thru down the street to surprise him. I bought us 2 large iced lattes, making sure his had extra caramel syrup to make up for the missing creamer, and bought a warm breakfast sandwich for his son who was coming over for the weekend. When I got back to the house, the mood seemed light and easy. We sat on the couch, drank the coffee, laughed at a video on his phone, and planned out the route to his ex-wife's house to pick up his boy. Before we walked out to his truck, I stopped by the front door, looked down at my gray sweatpants, my faded fleece jacket, and my slip-on flannel shoes, and asked him directly if we were going to be making any stops where I would need to step out of the vehicle. I told him explicitly that I hadn't showered yet, had no makeup on, looked like I'd just crawled out of a laundry basket, and didn't want to go inside anywhere looking like a complete mess. He looked me up and down, smiled casually, tossed his keys in his hand, and said, "No, you're fine. We're just driving straight to get him, coming right back home, and then we'll clean the garage together." Relieved, I hopped into the passenger seat, leaned my head against the window, and enjoyed the peaceful drive across town under the morning sun. We picked up his son, who scrambled into the back seat talking a mile a minute about a Lego set he wanted to build, and we turned around to head back toward our neighborhood. About 2 miles from our house, he suddenly glanced over at me, looked at the empty cup in his cup holder, and said his stomach was feeling off because he hadn't had his usual morning creamer before drinking the sweet Starbucks drink. He pointed toward a busy gas station on the corner of the highway intersection ahead. I looked at the packed parking lot, saw at least 6 cars lined up at the pumps, and gently suggested that we just drive the extra 3 minutes to our house, drop off his son with his toys, and then I would happily run out in my own car to the grocery store down the block to get whatever brand he wanted. He didn't slow down, didn't look at me, and didn't acknowledge my suggestion at all. Instead, he smoothly swung the truck across 2 lanes of traffic, pulled into a space directly in front of the brightly lit glass doors of the gas station, shifted the vehicle into park, and left the engine idling. He turned his head toward me, his arms resting heavy on the steering wheel, his expression completely blank. "Okay," he said, his voice flat and perfectly even. "Go." I stared at him for a second, assuming he was joking or that I had misheard him over the sound of the radio playing softly in the background. "What?" I asked, looking down at my fleece pajamas, my bare ankles, and the frayed slippers tucked against the floor mat. He didn't blink. He just adjusted his grip on the leather wheel, looked straight through the windshield at the store entrance, and let his words fall like heavy stones into the quiet cab of the truck. "Go get the creamer." "Babe," I said, my voice dropping an octave as I glanced nervously into the rearview mirror to see if his son was paying attention to us. "I asked you before we left the house if I was going to have to get out of the car. I'm literally in my pajamas and slippers. My hair isn't even brushed. Can't we just go home and I'll go to the store properly in 5 minutes?" He leaned slightly closer to the console, his eyes locking onto mine with an icy, unyielding precision that made the warm morning air in the truck feel instantly thin. "Oh well. Too bad," he said, speaking slowly as if he were explaining a simple math problem to a toddler. "You forgot it last night. So go handle it now." The plastic handle of my purse felt cold against my knuckles as I reached down to grab it off the floorboard, my face burning so hot I could feel the heat radiating against the cool air from the truck's dashboard vents. In the back seat, his 9-year-old son had gone quiet, his hands hovering over the unboxed Lego instructions in his lap, looking back and forth between his father's fixed posture and my trembling hands. I didn't say another word because I knew if I opened my mouth, the lump sitting squarely in the back of my throat would shatter into a sob right in front of a child who barely knew me. I unbuckled my seatbelt, pulled the heavy truck door open, and stepped out onto the oil-stained asphalt of the gas station parking lot, the thin soles of my flannel slippers absorbing every bump and piece of gravel underneath. Walking into that brightly lit store felt like walking onto a stage under a spotlight when you haven't rehearsed your lines. 2 men in work boots standing near the coffee urn stopped their conversation to look down at my sweatpants and fuzzy slippers, and the teenager behind the register didn't even try to hide his glance as I walked past the counter toward the refrigerated dairy section at the very back of the building. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely slide open the heavy glass door. I scanned the shelves once, twice, 3 times, my eyes blurring as I looked for the specific red bottle he liked, but all they had were small cartons of whole milk and plastic single-serve tubs of half and half. I stood there in front of the humming cooler for a full minute, squeezing my eyes shut, taking deep, silent breaths through my nose to keep the tears from spilling over onto my cheeks. I pulled a small quart of standard milk from the shelf, held it against my chest like a shield, and walked to the front register to pay. The cashier rang it up without making eye contact, passed me my small paper bag, and I walked back out into the morning air, looking straight at the ground until I pulled the truck door open and climbed back into the passenger seat. I placed the small bag gently on the console between us, pulled my seatbelt back across my waist, and sat completely silent, looking straight out the passenger window for the rest of the 3-minute drive back to our house. He drove with one hand on the wheel, humming along faintly to a song on the radio as if we had just completed a completely routine errand. When we pulled into the driveway, his son grabbed his toy box and ran inside toward the living room rug. I waited until the front door clicked shut behind the boy before I turned around in the kitchen, set the milk carton down on the counter with a quiet thud, and looked at my boyfriend while he unbuttoned his heavy outer jacket. My voice was quiet, but I forced myself to keep my eyes directly on his face. I told him that I felt deeply humiliated, that treating me like a misbehaving child in front of his son was unacceptable, and that being forced out into a store in my sleep clothes felt like an intentional punishment for a simple mistake I had already apologized for. I reminded him of conversations we'd had months ago about how I don't mind helping him or taking on tasks around the house, but that there is a massive difference between being a partner and being commanded around like an employee who failed an inspection. He stood by the refrigerator, crossed his arms over his chest, and leaned his weight back against the counter, his face devoid of any visible remorse. He told me that whenever he asks me to do something specific, I display an underlying resistance, and that because he was the one who asked for the creamer after a long, grueling work week, my forgetting it sent a clear message that his needs and his simple requests were completely unimportant to me. I took a breath, leaned against the dining table to steady myself, and explained the mechanics of what had actually happened the night before. I reminded him that I hadn't just ignored his request, I had literally opened the app, put the item in the cart, gotten interrupted by two competing priorities at once, and simply failed to push the final button. I pointed out that when he forgets to pick up my dry cleaning, or forgets to turn off the backyard lights, or loses his keys 3 times in a single week, I never once assumed that he did it out of spite or because he doesn't respect my time. I extend to him the basic benefit of the doubt that we love each other and that human beings are naturally flawed and forgetful. I asked him why I wasn't afforded that same basic grace, especially when he knows I am actively working with a doctor to manage my diagnosis. I looked at him across the kitchen island and said out loud what had been forming in my chest since we pulled into that gas station lot. It feels like whenever I make a mistake that frustrates you, you feel an absolute necessity to make an example out of me. He paused, looked down at the granite countertop for a long moment, shifted his weight, and then looked back up at me with absolute, chilling calm. He admitted that there was truth to that statement. He told me that he views those moments as holding up a mirror to my behavior. He explained his philosophy plainly. If talking to me about how my forgetfulness affects him doesn't instantly make me grasp the weight of his frustration, then he feels it is his responsibility as my partner to make me experience the exact physical or emotional equivalent of that frustration so that I will truly understand it and never do it again. Standing there in my kitchen, hearing a 40-year-old man calmly describe a deliberate strategy of emotional retaliation under the academic label of holding up a mirror, made the floor beneath my feet feel completely unstable. What he called a mirror was simply an eye-for-an-eye punishment system wrapped up in therapeutic jargon. To him, if my unintentional executive dysfunction caused him a minor inconvenience, he felt fully justified in manufacturing an intentional, embarrassing inconvenience for me to balance the scales. He saw the look on my face and stepped forward, taking a soft breath, shifting his posture, and offering a quiet apology. He said he hadn't meant to make me cry in front of his son, that he was just exhausted from working 60 hours, and that he loved me and wanted our future marriage to work. He kissed my forehead, took the milk, poured a splash into his mug, and walked into the living room to help his son build the Lego set, seemingly completely satisfied that the matter had been addressed, processed, and settled. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my home office under the pretense of organizing files, but I just sat at my desk looking at the open notebook in front of me. We have been planning a life together, picking out rings, talking about merging our finances, and discussing how we will manage a household with his son. I don't expect a partner to be perfect. I know that people get tired, stressed out, and irritable after long work shifts, and I know that living with someone who has ADHD requires genuine patience and open systems of communication. But there is a canyon-wide difference between working through the friction of everyday forgetfulness together, and living under the thumb of a man who secretly reserves the right to penalize you the moment you step out of line. I realized then that I wasn't scared of accidentally forgetting the creamer again, I was terrified of what new lesson he would decide to teach me the next time I fell short of his standards.